A luxury restaurant falls silent. A waitress is laughing. In front of her sits a quiet man in simple clothes. She tosses the bill onto the table. Then she says loudly, "Maybe try a place you can actually afford." The restaurant laughs. The man doesn't react. He simply pulls a black card from his wallet and places it on the table. Suddenly, the manager turns pale, because that card means only one thing. And the waitress just insulted the owner of the building. Then say, because the man she mocked wasn't just rich. He owned far more than anyone in that restaurant realized. The man sitting at the small corner table didn't look important. His clothes were simple. No expensive watch. No designer suit. No sign of wealth. Just a quiet man sitting alone. Most people in the restaurant didn't even notice him. And the few who did quickly looked away. To them, he looked like someone who probably saved money just to eat in a place like this. But they were wrong. Very wrong. His name was Smith Russel. And Smith Russel was not an ordinary customer. He was calm. The kind of calm that made people feel uneasy without knowing why. He was observant. His eyes moved slowly around the restaurant, noticing every small detail. And he was quiet. He spoke very little. But behind that quiet presence was a man who owned a massive business empire. Hotels, luxury buildings, restaurants, companies spread across several cities. Smith Russel was worth more money than most people in the room could imagine. Yet looking at him, you would never guess it, because Smith hated attention. He hated expensive suits. He hated walking into places and having everyone suddenly act different. So sometimes, he did something unusual. Smith would visit his own businesses, but he would do it quietly, without telling anyone who he was. No warning, no preparation, no special treatment, just like a normal customer. Because Smith believed something very simple. When people think you are nobody, that's when they show their true character. And tonight, he decided to visit one of his own restaurants. A place that used to be one of the most successful locations in his company. Years ago, customers would wait outside just to get a table. The service was famous. The staff were known for being professional and respectful. At least, that's how it used to be. Smith sat quietly at his table. For the first few minutes, he didn't order anything. He just watched. And the more he watched, the more something started to bother him. A waiter walked past a customer who was clearly trying to get his attention. Two staff members stood near the counter laughing while a table waited for their drinks. Another customer raised his hand twice before someone finally noticed him. Smith slowly tapped his fingers on the table. Not angrily, but thoughtfully. Something here wasn't right. This restaurant used to run perfectly. Now it felt careless, unorganized, almost disrespectful. Then, something else caught his attention. A waitress. She stood near the center of the restaurant holding a small notepad. But instead of focusing on the customers, she was gossiping with another staff member, laughing, pointing at different tables, judging people. Her eyes slowly moved across the room. Then suddenly, they stopped, right on Smith. She looked at him from head to toe. His simple clothes, his quiet posture, his cheap-looking jacket. And slowly, a small smile appeared on her face. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile people make when they believe they have already figured you out. Smith noticed it immediately, but he didn't react. He simply leaned back slightly in his chair, watching, observing, because something told him this night was about to reveal more than he expected. And the waitress who just judged him was about to make the biggest mistake of her night. For a moment, the waitress continued staring at Smith Russel. Then she leaned closer to the waiter beside her and whispered something. The waiter turned his head. He looked directly at Smith. Then both of them laughed quietly. Smith saw it. He heard part of it too, but he didn't react. Instead, he simply sat there, calm and patient. Finally, the waitress walked toward his table. But there was something strange about the way she walked. Slow, uninterested, like serving him was the last thing she wanted to do. She stopped beside the table and didn't even smile. "Yeah?" she said casually. What do you want? No greeting. No welcome. No professionalism. Smith slowly closed the menu he had been looking at. He looked up at her calmly. Just a coffee for now, he said. The waitress raised one eyebrow. Just coffee? She asked. Her tone made it sound like that wasn't good enough. Smith nodded. Yes. She scribbled something quickly on her notepad. Then she looked at him again. This time her eyes moved over his clothes, his shoes, his old jacket. And again, that same mocking smile appeared on her face. She turned and walked back to the counter. The moment she reached the other waiter, she leaned closer and spoke again. This time, Smith heard it clearly. Corner table guy, she whispered. He's definitely not ordering anything else. The waiter chuckled. Why? She shrugged. Look at him. People like that come here just to sit and act important. They both laughed again. Across the room, Smith quietly watched them. His face showed no anger, no embarrassment, nothing. But inside his mind, he was taking notes. This wasn't just about one rude comment. This was something deeper. Something about the culture of the staff. Something about how they treated people they believed were beneath them. Smith leaned back slightly in his chair, because moments like this reminded him of something he always believed. You don't truly know a person when they think you're powerful. You know them when they think you're powerless. A few minutes later, the waitress returned with his coffee. She placed it on the table quickly. Too quickly. The cup slid slightly before stopping. Not even a word. Not even enjoy your drink. She had already turned to walk away. But then she stopped. She looked back at him one more time. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Then she said something under her breath. Just loud enough for him to hear. Try not to sit too long. This isn't a library. Then she walked away. Smith slowly lifted the coffee cup. The drink was fine, but that wasn't what he was thinking about. His eyes moved around the restaurant again, watching, observing, and the more he watched, the more he realized something important. This place didn't just have a service problem. It had a leadership problem. Because when a team behaves like this, it usually means one thing. No one important has been watching for a long time. Smith gently placed the cup back on the table. And across the restaurant, the same waitress looked at him again. Still smiling. Still confident. Still believing the quiet man in the corner was just another nobody. She had no idea. The man she was mocking owned everything around her. Smith Russel slowly placed the coffee cup back on the table. The drink was warm, but his attention was no longer on the coffee. It was at a restaurant. From his corner seat, he could see almost everything. A couple near the window had been waiting several minutes for their food. The man checked his watch. The woman sighed quietly. Still, no one came to their table. Across the room, another customer tried to call a waiter. He raised his hand once. No response. He raised it again. Still nothing. Finally, a waiter walked past him without even looking. Smith's eyes narrowed slightly. This wasn't normal. Not for this place. Years ago, this restaurant had a reputation. Fast service. Professional staff. Customers are treated with respect. That was the standard Smith had built across his entire company. But what he was seeing tonight was the complete opposite. Near the counter, two employees were leaning against the wall, talking, laughing. One of them was scrolling through his phone. Meanwhile, 3 tables were still waiting to be served. Smith tapped his fingers lightly on the table again. Slow, thoughtful. Something had clearly changed here, and he needed to understand why. His eyes moved toward the waitress again, the same one who had served his coffee. She was standing near another table now. But instead of listening to the customer, she looked bored. Her body language said everything. Impatient, uninterested, almost annoyed that she even had to be there. The customer tried asking a question about the menu. The waitress responded quickly, too quickly, without even making eye contact. Then she walked away before the customer had finished speaking. Smith watched the entire interaction, and something inside him hardened slightly. because this wasn't just bad service. This was something worse. Disrespect. The kind that slowly destroys a business from the inside. He had seen it happen before. One careless employee becomes two. Two become five. Soon the entire culture changes. Customers stop coming. Reputation disappears. And a once successful place slowly collapses. Smith leaned back in his chair. His expression remained calm. But inside he was thinking carefully. Because this restaurant used to be one of the best performing locations in his entire company. Now it felt like a place that had forgotten its own standards. And then, something else caught his attention. A man at a nearby table was trying to get the waitress's attention. He called out politely, "Excuse me." The waitress heard him. Smith saw it clearly, but she pretended not to. Instead, she continued talking to another staff member, laughing again, ignoring the customer completely. The man looked embarrassed. He slowly lowered his hand. Around the restaurant, a few other people noticed too, but no one said anything. Smith watched the moment carefully, because small moments like this reveal big problems. Respect, responsibility, pride in the work. All of it seemed to be missing here. Then his eyes returned to the waitress. She glanced toward Smith again, and when she noticed him watching, she smirked, like she already knew exactly who he was. Just another quiet man sitting alone. Just another customer she didn't need to take seriously. Smith slowly reached for his coffee again. But this time, a small thought crossed his mind. Tonight might turn into more than just a quiet visit. Because if the problems here were really this deep, someone was going to have to answer for it. And the waitress who kept mocking him was about to become part of a lesson she would never forget. Smith Russel sat quietly for a few more minutes. His coffee was almost finished. Around him, the restaurant continued moving in the same careless rhythm. Customers waiting, staff talking, orders delayed. But Smith had already made a decision. He was no longer just observing. Now he wanted to test something. He raised his hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough to signal that he was ready to order. For a moment, no one noticed. Two waiters walked past his table. Neither of them even looked in his direction. Finally, the same waitress noticed him. She sighed softly, as if helping him was an inconvenience. Then she slowly walked over. When she reached the table, she didn't greet him. She simply stood there, holding her notepad. "Yes?" she said flatly. Smith looked up at her calmly. "I'd like to order dinner," he said. She crossed her arms slightly. Her eyes moved over him again, from his jacket to his shoes, then back to his face. "You sure?" Smith remained calm. "Yes," he replied. She opened the menu and pointed to one of the most expensive dishes. "The steak here isn't cheap," she said. Some customers at the nearby tables began to listen. The conversation was getting attention. Smith glanced briefly at the menu. Then he nodded. "I'll have that." The waitress raised her eyebrows. Then she let out a small laugh. Not loud, but loud enough. "You know," she said, leaning slightly closer, "some people just order coffee and sit here all night." A couple at the next table looked over. The man smirked slightly. Smith remained completely still. His expression didn't change. "I'll also take the chef's recommendation," he added calmly. Now the waitress looked slightly surprised. For a moment she studied him again, trying to understand him, trying to decide if he was serious. Finally, she wrote the order down. But the mocking tone didn't disappear. "Well," she said, closing the notepad, "don't say I didn't warn you." Then she turned and walked away. Behind the counter, she leaned toward the same waiter again. Smith couldn't hear every word, but he heard enough. "The corner table just ordered the steak," she whispered. The waiter looked over at Smith. Then he chuckled. "Good luck getting paid." They both laughed quietly. Smith noticed it. Of course he did. But he didn't react. Instead, he simply leaned back in his chair, watching the room again, watching the staff, watching the culture of the place he had built. Because this moment was telling him more than any report ever could. Across the restaurant, The waitress placed the order into the kitchen. Then she looked back at Smith one more time, still smiling, still confident, still completely sure she understood exactly who he was. But she didn't, not even close. And soon, that misunderstanding was going to change everything. Nearly 30 minutes passed. Smith Russel finished his meal quietly. The steak was good. The chef had clearly done his job well. But the service around him hadn't improved. If anything, it had become worse. 2 customers near the entrance had already complained about their order. Another table was still waiting for drinks. And the same careless attitude filled the room. Smith wiped his hands slowly with the napkin and placed it beside his plate. He had seen enough. Across the room, the waitress finally noticed he had finished. She walked toward the table again. But her expression hadn't changed. Still bored. Still unimpressed. She didn't ask if the meal was good. She didn't ask if he needed anything else. Instead, she pulled a small receipt from her pocket. Without a word, she dropped the bill onto the table. The paper slid across the surface and stopped in front of him. Then she crossed her arms. "You can pay at the counter," she said. But before turning away, she added something else. Something louder. Loud enough for several nearby tables to hear. "Hopefully your card doesn't decline." A few people chuckled softly. Someone at the next table shook his head with a small smirk. The waitress clearly enjoyed the moment. She thought it was funny. To her, this quiet man in simple clothes was just another customer trying to act richer than he really was. Smith slowly picked up the bill. He glanced at the total. Then he placed it back on the table. His face remained calm. No anger. No embarrassment. Just the same quiet expression he had carried all night. The waitress was still standing nearby, watching, waiting, almost expecting a scene. But instead, Smith reached into his jacket pocket. His movements were slow and deliberate. He pulled out a simple black wallet. From inside it, he removed a card. A sleek black card. No bright colors. No flashy design. Just a smooth, dark surface that reflected the restaurant lights. Smith placed it gently on top of the bill. The waitress stepped closer and picked it up confidently. First, she didn't even look at it carefully. But then, her eyes moved to the name engraved on the front. And suddenly, her smile disappeared. Her fingers froze. For a moment, she simply stared at the card in silence. Then she looked up at Smith again. This time, there was no mocking smile, only confusion, because the name on the card said something she never expected to see. Smith Russel. And there was only one person in the entire company who carried a card like that. Across the room, the manager had just noticed the situation. He walked closer to see what was happening. The waitress slowly handed him the card. Still speechless, the manager glanced at it. And the moment he read the name, the color drained from his face. His eyes widened slightly. Then he looked at the quiet man sitting at the table. The same man everyone had been laughing at. The same man the waitress had mocked all night. And suddenly, the manager understood something terrifying. The person sitting in front of them, I was not just a customer. He was the man who owned the restaurant. And the entire room was about to find out. For a few seconds, the restaurant felt strangely quiet. The manager stood frozen with the card in his hand. His eyes moved slowly from the card, back to the man sitting at the table. Smith Russel. The name echoed inside his head, because there was no mistake. He had seen that name many times before, on company reports, on contracts, on the documents that controlled every restaurant in the chain. This was the owner, the founder, the man who built everything. And he was sitting right here, in the corner table, dressed like an ordinary customer. The manager swallowed hard. Then he quickly stepped forward. His voice suddenly became nervous. "Sir, I didn't know you were coming tonight." Several customers nearby looked up immediately. The conversation around the room began to slow. The waitress stood beside him, still confused. "What do you mean?" she whispered. The manager ignored her. His full attention was on Smith now. Smith looked up calmly. His expression hadn't changed. Not even slightly. You weren't supposed to know, Smith replied quietly. The manager felt his heart sink. Because those words confirmed everything. This wasn't a scheduled visit. This was a surprise. And that meant Smith had seen everything. The slow service, the careless staff, the rude behavior, and worst of all, the way the waitress had treated him. The waitress finally spoke again. Her voice was uncertain. Wait! What's going on? The manager slowly turned toward her. His face was pale now. His voice lowered. Do you know who this is? She shook her head. No. The manager held up the black card, his hand trembling slightly. This is Mr. Smith Russel. For a moment, the words didn't make sense to her. Then suddenly, her eyes widened. Her mind started connecting the pieces. The quiet man, the simple clothes, the black card, the manager's reaction. Her stomach dropped, because she had heard that name before. Everyone who worked here had. Smith Russel, the man who owned the entire company, the man who owned the restaurant, the man she had been mocking all night. Her face slowly lost all color. She turned back toward the table, toward the quiet man she had laughed at. But now, nothing about him looked small anymore. Nothing about him looked unimportant. Because suddenly, she realized something terrifying. Every rude word she had said, every mocking comment, every moment she treated him like he didn't belong, had been directed at the one person in the room who could change her entire future. The restaurant was no longer laughing. People were whispering now, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. But Smith Russel remained exactly the same. Calm, quiet, observant. He slowly stood up from the table. And the moment he did, the entire room fell silent. The moment Smith Russel stood up, the entire restaurant became silent. Every conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward the corner table. The quiet man who nobody noticed earlier was now the center of the entire room. Smith adjusted his jacket calmly. His movements were slow and controlled. No anger, no shouting, just quiet authority. The manager stepped aside immediately, giving him space. Sir, I'm very sorry, the manager said quickly. But Smith raised one hand slightly. The manager stopped talking at once. Then Smith turned his attention to the waitress. She was no longer smiling. Her face had completely changed. The confidence she had earlier was gone. Now she looked nervous, almost afraid. I didn't know, she started to say. But Smith interrupted her gently. I know, he said. His voice was calm, not loud. Yet everyone in the restaurant could hear it. That's the point. The waitress lowered her eyes. Her hands were shaking slightly now, because she suddenly understood something important. This wasn't about the card. This wasn't about money. This was about how she treated someone she believed had none. Smith looked around the restaurant slowly. He noticed the customers watching, the staff standing still, the tension filling the room. Then his eyes returned to the waitress. Tell me something, he said calmly. When you first saw me, what did you think? The waitress hesitated. She didn't want to answer, but the silence in the room made it impossible to escape the question. I thought, she said quietly. She stopped again. Smith waited patiently. Finally, she finished the sentence. I thought you couldn't afford to eat here. A few customers exchanged looks. Some of them remembered the comments she made earlier. Smith nodded slowly. And because of that, you treated me differently. The waitress didn't respond. She couldn't, because it was true. Smith placed his hands behind his back and took a few slow steps across the floor. The sound of his shoes echoed slightly in the quiet restaurant. Then he stopped and looked at the staff. All of you, he said calmly. This restaurant used to be one of the best in the company. No one spoke. Tonight, he continued, I saw customers being ignored. A waiter looked down at the floor. I saw staff laughing while people waited. 2 employees near the counter shifted uncomfortably. And I saw a waitress mock someone. Simply because she believed he was poor. The waitress felt her throat tighten. Smith turned back toward her. But his voice remained steady. Not angry, just firm. You didn't disrespect me because of who I am, he said. You disrespected me because of who you thought I was. The words hung heavily in the air. Around the room, the customers were completely silent now, watching, listening, because the power in the room had completely shifted. The man everyone thought was just another customer was the one who controlled everything. The waitress slowly lifted her head again. Her voice was almost shaking. I'm sorry, she said quietly. But Smith shook his head slightly. Don't apologize to me. The waitress looked confused. Smith gestured toward the restaurant. Apologize to them. He pointed toward the customers sitting at the tables. The people who come here expecting respect. The waitress turned slowly toward the room. And for the first time that night, she truly understood how many people had witnessed her behavior. Her face turned red with embarrassment. But the lesson wasn't over yet, because Smith Russel wasn't finished. The waitress stood there for a moment. The entire restaurant was watching her. Customers, waiters, the manager. No one spoke. The confidence she had earlier was completely gone. Slowly, she turned toward the nearest table, a middle-aged couple who had been waiting earlier. Her voice was quiet now. I'm sorry for the way I treated everyone tonight. The words felt heavy coming out of her mouth, because this time, they were real. A few customers nodded slightly. Others simply watched in silence. Then she turned back towards Smith Russel. He was still standing calmly in the middle of the room, watching everything, observing, just like he had been doing since he walked in. The manager stepped forward again. Sir, we will fix this, he said quickly. We'll retrain the staff, we'll. Smith raised his hand again. The manager immediately stopped talking. This isn't just about training, Smith said calmly. His eyes moved across the room, from one employee to another. This is about attitude. He took a few slow steps across the restaurant floor. When people walk into a place like this, he continued, they're not just paying for food. He looked toward the customers. They're paying for respect. Then his eyes returned to the staff. And respect should never depend on how someone looks. The room remained silent. Every employee was listening carefully now, because the message was clear. Smith turned back toward the waitress one more time. When you looked at me tonight, he said calmly, you saw someone you thought didn't belong here. She lowered her head again. But the truth is, Smith continued, a restaurant like this only exists because every customer belongs here. The words were simple, but they carried weight, because everyone in the room knew he was right. Smith paused for a moment. Then he gave a small nod toward the manager. This place used to be one of the best in the company. The manager looked ashamed. It can be that way again, Smith said. But only if the people working here understand something very important. The staff waited. Smith spoke the final sentence slowly. Character shows itself when you think no one important is watching. The words filled the room. And suddenly everyone understood why he had come quietly. Why did he dress simply? Why did he sit in the corner observing everything? He hadn't come just to eat. He had come to see the truth. And tonight, the truth had revealed itself clearly. The restaurant remained silent after Smith Russel finished speaking. His words were still hanging in the air. No one moved. No one dared to interrupt. The waitress stood in the same place, her hands tightly holding the notepad she had been carrying all night. Just a short time ago, she had felt confident, in control, certain that the quiet man in the corner was nobody important. Now everything had changed. Smith looked at the manager. Bring the staff here, he said calmly. The manager quickly nodded. Within moments, the waiters and other employees gathered near the center of the restaurant. Some looked nervous. Others looked ashamed. Smith studied their faces carefully. He had built many businesses over the years, and he understood something very well. A business does not fail because of one mistake. It fails when people stop caring. Finally, his eyes returned to the waitress. What is your name? He asked. She swallowed nervously. Emily, she said quietly. Smith nodded once. Emily, he repeated. Then he spoke in the same calm voice. You made a mistake tonight. She lowered her head. Yes, sir. But mistakes can teach people something, Smith continued. The staff listened carefully, because no one knew what he was about to do. Smith took a slow step closer. You have two choices, he said. Emily slowly looked up. Her heart was beating fast. The entire restaurant seemed to be waiting for the next words. You can leave this job tonight, Smith said. Her face tightened immediately. But there is another option. Emily held her breath. You can stay. The room grew even quieter. But if you stay, Smith continued, you start again from the bottom. Emily looked confused. Smith explained calmly. You will spend the next months learning how to treat customers properly. You will help serve tables. You will clean. You will learn respect the same way everyone else here should have learned it. The staff exchanged surprised looks. They expected anger. They expected someone to be fired immediately. But this was something different. This was a lesson. Smith folded his hands behind his back. The choice is yours, he said simply. Emily stood frozen. Her mind was racing. Just hours ago, she thought this job was easy. Something she barely cared about. Now it suddenly felt very important. Because she understood something she hadn't understood before. Respect was not about the person standing in front of you. It was about the person you chose to be. Her eyes slowly filled with tears. Not from fear. From realization. She took a small step forward. I want to stay, she said quietly. The words were honest. Because for the first time that night, she truly wanted to change. Smith studied her face for a moment. Then he gave a small nod. Good, he said. Then he turned toward the manager. Make sure everyone here remembers tonight. The manager nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Smith looked around the restaurant one last time. At the staff. At the customers. At the place he had built from nothing. Then he picked up his jacket and began walking toward the door. But before leaving, he stopped for one final moment, because there was still one last thing he wanted everyone in the room to understand. Smith Russel paused near the restaurant door. His hand rested lightly on the handle. Behind him, the entire room was still silent. The staff stood together near the center of the floor. The customers watched quietly from their tables. Everyone was waiting. Smith slowly turned back toward them. His expression was the same calm one he had carried the entire night. No anger, no pride, just quiet certainty. I built my first restaurant with almost nothing, he said. His voice was steady. Just a small kitchen, a few tables, and a belief. The employees listened carefully. Not a belief about food, he continued. A belief about people. He glanced toward the customers sitting around the room. A restaurant can serve the best meal in the world. He paused. But if the people inside treat others with disrespect, then the business is already failing. The manager lowered his head slightly. The staff shifted uncomfortably, because everyone understood exactly what he meant. Smith looked at Emily one last time. She was standing quietly now. No arrogance. No mocking smile. Just someone who had learned a hard lesson. Smith gave a small nod. Everyone deserves respect the moment they walk through that door. He pointed gently toward the entrance. Not because they are rich. Not because they look important. But because they are human. The room remained completely still. Then Smith opened the door. Cool night air moved slightly into the restaurant. He stepped outside calmly. No celebration. No dramatic exit. Just a quiet man walking away. Inside the restaurant, people slowly began to move again. Customers started talking softly. The staff looked at each other differently now. Something had changed. Near the counter, Emily wiped her eyes and took a deep breath. Then she picked up her notepad again. But this time, she walked to the nearest table with a completely different attitude. Good evening, she said politely. How can I help you? Across the room, the manager watched silently, because he knew something important had just happened tonight. Not just a warning, not just a lesson, but a reminder. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody notices, and sometimes the smallest moment of arrogance can reveal the biggest truth.